But we are in this last lesson, and I don't know why that doesn't appear better. Anyway, chapters 28 to 34 of Deuteronomy. So my hope is that having gone through these, even though we've looked at them in a broad way, that we've got a better understanding of these three books. I think generally speaking, Genesis and Exodus we're more familiar with. But by going through these, we become a little more familiar, maybe than we've been before, and then that's a basis for further study. So we talked about Deuteronomy, and we talked about three broad sections here. I didn't really say this last week, but what would you say is the theme of Deuteronomy? Not a trick question, and I'd say it's one word. And it's a very familiar word. In fact, we sing a song that's got the word in it. We'd be really familiar. Do you need more clues? Yeah, I haven't done a very good job of saying that, but it struck me that really obedience is what this is all about. I mean, over and over and over, Moses, when he's talking to the people, says you need to obey. And the reason for that will become very obvious tonight when we read some of these latter sections, because there are going to be penalties if they don't obey. So all the way through, Moses is exhorting them to obey what God has commanded. The first 11 chapters are really almost like a sermon of sorts. Chapters 1 to 3, Moses talks about the past and what had happened up until the time that they've gotten to where they are camped across from the promised land. Then chapter 5 is a repeat of the 10 commandments. And then chapters 6 to 11 are really an exhortation to Israel to obey and to do what God says. And there are a lot of different reasons for that. And we won't go through all those again right now, but that's kind of where we left things. So what did we say last time about the clarification of the laws in chapters 12 to 27? More detailed. And what did we suggest might be the case in the way they're structured there? You know, it looks like just lots of chapters of lots of detail about what those involve, but what did we also suggest? They might be grouped how? Okay, based on the 10 commandments, you can kind of see how the initial ones have to do with idolatry, and then not taking the name, the Lord's name in vain. Even the false prophets speaking in the name of the Lord would be taking his name in vain. And then things that surround the Sabbath. And then we talked about different areas of leadership, which would have to do with honoring leadership, which comes from honoring father and mother. And then we kind of touched on some of the latter ones that had to do with thou shalt not murder, and then there are others involved. But that is greater explanation of what the specifics might be, and especially as they get close to entering into the land, some of the things required have changed from their having been in the wilderness for 40 years. So having said all of that, we get to, I'll get to that in a moment. This chart just suggests that chapters 12 to 27 talk about what's previously been said, but then point forward to application. So that's what we were saying about the further explanation about the different commandments that God has given. Okay, so now chapters 27 to 34, we're going to look at Moses' final address to the people, and it's kind of broken up into different sections here, but we want to look and see what each of these sections involves. And again, we can't just go verse by verse, but we'll do that to some extent. So let me just say that this layout that we're talking about here, where you have a general address at the outset and a expression of you need to do what's here, and then some explanation about the law, and then maybe the consequences that are going to arise. All of that is not unlike other writings, other treaties, other covenants of antiquity. which is not to say that Moses was borrowing that. It's just to say that this kind of fits the way that other things were stated. And so it's not anything out of keeping with what people might have been accustomed to. But of course, it's coming from God, and that's the difference. So if you notice in chapter 27, what's in chapter 27? What's that chapter about? Okay, yeah, the curses of the law. And he says in verse 2, on the day you cross over the Jordan to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, you shall set up large stones, plaster them with plaster, write on them all the words of this law. And then he goes on and says some other things. And then dropping down to verse 9, then they charge the people, when you've crossed over the Jordan, actually down in verse 12, these shall stand on Mount Gerizim to bless the people. And then he says, others shall stand on Mount Ebal to declare the curse. But then look at verse from 15 down through the end of that chapter. Are any number of curses that are said to be a part of a failure to keep these various commands. Now, why do you suppose, and then we'll get to chapters 28 to 30 that talk about blessings and cursings, why do you suppose this is so heavy on the curses here in chapter 27 and then repeated again, we'll see here in a moment? Okay. Okay. They're going into a land where the people weren't following God. In fact, we said chapter 7, that's why God is taking the people out, actually chapter 9. It's not because of your righteousness, but because of their wickedness. And I think it says, yeah, go ahead, Ian. I think you're exactly right. He is hammering the idea that there are going to be consequences if you don't, what's our theme? Obey. So it's almost like this is added emphasis on this thought that you need to keep the law. That's going to be to your benefit, and not doing it is going to result in, well, curses that come upon you. All right, so having said that, let's look at chapter 28. And so he starts out. Look at verse 1. If you faithfully obey the voice of the Lord your God, being careful to do all his commandments that I command you, there are going to be some benefits. Now, just looking down through verses 1 to 14, what's kind of a key word that keeps popping up? Blessed. Blessed shall you be, okay? So let's look at some of the things that are going to be blessings. Verse 4, notice that he says, blessed shall be the fruit of your womb, and the fruit of your ground, and the fruit of your cattle, the increase of your herds, and the young of your flock. Blessed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. Okay? So, various aspects to that, but it all has to do with their being blessed in terms of reproducing themselves, the food that they eat, the animals that they keep. They're going to be blessed if they do what God says. Why is that important? Is that a big deal? Yeah, I would think so. It's kind of like, is the nation going to continue to exist? Are they going to be able to reproduce? Are their animals going to provide for them? Are their crops going to be what they need? Okay. Well, let's drop down to verse 5, and he talks about this abundance of their basket and their kneading bowl. And then in verses 6 and 7, Blessed shall you be when you come in, and blessed shall you be when you go out. The Lord will cause your enemies who rise against you to be defeated before you. They shall come out against you one way and flee before you 7 ways. So, why is that important?
He's taking away the concern people might have in regards to your enemies and the ability to go in and out and throughout the land, showing them that if you obey me, I'll protect you.
Okay.
I'll provide for you. I'll do all these things for you. You just have to obey.
Okay.
And do as I ask you to do.
All right. So they just spent 40 years wandering because they didn't think they could take the land. And so he says, well, here is this fear cropping up again, possibly. Are we going to be able to go in with these people in the land? And he says, the Lord will bless you, and he'll cause your enemies to be defeated, and they'll flee before you 7 ways if you obey. Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Derek. Yeah. All of these descriptions here too make me think that this is all connected to the description that was given early on. Okay. To a land that is floating. Okay, I think so. Yeah, so Derek's saying this is part of the package, that you're going to get a land that's kind of bursting at the seams, and you can go in and enjoy all the fruit of the land, but it's going to be based upon you obeying God. All right. And then dropping down to verses 11 and 12, note this prosperity here. He says, and the Lord will make you abound in prosperity, which includes, again, the fruit of your womb, the fruit of your livestock, the fruit of your ground, within the land that the Lord swore to your fathers to give you. Note verse 12. How's that going to be taking place? What's one of the reasons? Yeah, there's going to be rain. We know the importance of rain, don't we? You need rain to water the crops. So he says, he'll give you his good treasury, the heavens, and that's going to supply rain in its season to bless the work of your hands. You shall lend to many nations, but you shall not borrow. That'd be great, wouldn't it? You're a lender, not a borrower. Sounds like that might be some wise advice for the country. Okay? So all of these different things that he mentions, but now the tables turn. So I think I counted about 6 bless or blessed sections there in verses 1 to 14. But he turns his attention, and really a bigger attention, to the curses. Now, what's interesting about the curses, if you look at them here, he talks about, he had said about Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. So let's look at where that is. If you blow the map up, so there they are encamped across from Canaan. And then you've got Shechem up there in the little square. And if you blow that up, which I think this next photo does, this next map, okay. So notice you've got Mount Ebal to the north. Okay, I'm hitting the wrong thing, or it's not working. Nope. All right, anyway, you can see that. Mount Ebal to the north, Mount Gerizim to the south, and Shechem, which comes up in different situations right in between them. All right, this is what that looks like. So this is looking from the east. So this is looking from the side there at Mount Ebal, which was on the north. Okay, so this is like several pictures of the same thing, but just, so there you got Mount Ebal on the right to the north, Mount Gerizim to the left, which is to the south. We're still looking from the east side. And then you've got Shechem there in between. Of course, that's modern day. So here again is Mount Gerizim, which is on one side, and then there's the summit from down in the middle. And then looking east, and Mount Ebal is over on the left-hand side. So you get the picture. There's these 2 mountains side by side almost, a little valley in between. And so what they're going to do is they're told to read when they go into the land, and we'll see that when they do. They're to read the blessings and they're to read the cursings. One side reads the blessings, the other side reads the cursings. I think Mount Ebal is the cursings, Mount Gerizim the blessings. Okay. So let's look at what the cursings involve. And as you read down through there, just kind of skim down through there, like take verses 15 to 20 or 15 to 19. What do you sort of notice about the way these are stated? Opposite, yeah. Just kind of the contrast to what he had said before. All the blessings you're going to get if you obey, well, now you're going to be cursed if you disobey. So look at verse 16. Cursed shall you be in the city, cursed shall you be in the field, cursed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl, cursed shall be the fruit of your womb, the fruit of your ground, the increase of your herds, the young of the flock. When you go in, when you come out. But then he adds some other things to that. Okay, look at verses 20 to 24. He will send on you curses, confusion, frustration in all that you undertake to do. Destroyed, perish quickly on account of the evil of your deeds. Pestilence will stick to you until he's consumed you. Verse 22, the Lord will strike you with wasting disease, with fever, inflammation, fiery heat. And then notice drought, blight, mildew. And then verse 23, the heavens over your head shall be bronze, and the earth under you shall be iron. Well, what's he mean by that? Yeah, no rain is what he's talking about. The rain of your land will become powder. From heaven, dust shall come down unto you until you are destroyed. So you can just see, it's really the opposite of what that blessing is going to be. It's going to affect the various areas that were just necessities for them. Well, it gets worse. 25 to 37. He'll cause you to be defeated before your enemies, verse 25. And now instead of them fleeing 7 ways, you'll go out and you'll flee 7 ways from before them. And notice he says, you'll be a horror to all the kingdoms of the earth. What do you suppose he's talking about there? Okay, yeah. It's a little bit like, you're going down the road and traffic slows down and, you see this little fender bender and everybody slows down to look at what's going on. Well, he says, you're going to be that wreck over there on the side and you're going to be a horror to others. They're going to see you and they're going to see what's happened to you. And that's the response that they're going to have. And it just keeps piling on, doesn't it? Your dead body shall be food for all birds of the air, beasts of the earth. No one to frighten them away. What's the picture there? Here's that carry-on that's kind of cleaning up, what's dead, and nobody's going to shoo them away. So it's not a pretty picture at all. Strike you with the boils of Egypt, tumors, scabs, the itch which you cannot be healed. Strike you with madness, blindness, confusion of mind, grope at noonday, on and on. You shall only be only oppressed and robbed continually. No one to help you. You shall betroth the wife, but another man shall ravish her. You shall build a house, but you'll not dwell in it. You shall plant a vineyard, but you shall not enjoy its fruit. Well, we could go on, and you can read down through there, and it even gets worse because he describes what's going to happen, when they are attacked from other nations. Verse 33, a nation that you've not known shall eat up the fruit of your ground and of all your labors, and ye shall only be oppressed and crushed continually. Driven mad, the Lord will strike you on the knees and on the legs with grievous boils, which cannot be healed. And then he says, verse 36, the Lord will bring you and your king whom you set over you to a nation that neither you nor your fathers have known. And there you shall serve other gods of wood and stone, and you shall become a horror, a proverb, and a byword among all the peoples where the Lord will lead you. And then notice he talks about how their crops are going to be destroyed by insects, this failure of their having any rain. It's going to affect everything from top to bottom.
It's interesting to hear how Moses is giving them a prophetic word.
Yes,
Your king,
yes.
he had to establish,
Okay,
but God knew that eventually that's what they were going to ask.
yeah. And that's interesting to trace this idea of a king, their desire to have one. God apparently will allow it, but how does that transpire? How does that come about? And what takes place when they request a king, and what kinds of kings are they given, and where does that end up with them? Okay, look down at verse 52. Let me keep going here. He says, they shall besiege you in all your towns until your high and fortified walls in which you trusted come down throughout all your land. They'll besiege you in your towns. And then this horrific description in verse 53, you shall eat the fruit of your womb, the flesh of your sons and daughters. Did that happen to Israel? It did. And that happens as a result of a city being besieged and being surrounded, and there's no food to eat inside the city, and ultimately that's what they turn to, is this kind of cannibalistic behavior. But all of that is going to come about. And as you stated there, this is prophetic, because it's almost as if it reads like what does happen to them. And of course God knows that, but Moses is trying to warn them against it. All right, so more description in there. We won't read it all. Verse 58, if you are not careful to do all the words of this law that are written, that you may fear this glorious and awesome name, the Lord your God, then the Lord will bring on you and your offspring extraordinary afflictions, severe, lasting, sicknesses, grievous and lasting. He will bring upon you again all the diseases of Egypt. Now, I should have looked it up. There's an earlier statement in Exodus where he says, I'm going to spare you from all these diseases. Now he's saying, I'm going to bring these diseases upon you. Just the opposite. Whereas, verse 62, you are as numerous as the stars of heaven, you'll be left few in number, because you did not, there's our word, obey the voice of the Lord your God. And so it's going to result in your ruin. Verse 64, the Lord will scatter you among all peoples from one end of the earth to the other. And there you'll serve other gods of wood and stone, which neither you nor your fathers have known. You won't find respite, on and on. Verse 67, in the morning you shall say, if only it were evening, and at evening you shall say, if only it were morning, because of the dread that your heart shall feel, and the sights that your eyes shall see. And look at verse 68. The Lord will bring you back in ships to Egypt, a journey I promised that you would never make again. What do you suppose he's talking about there? Bring you in ships back to Egypt. Any record of the Israelites getting in ships and sailing back to Egypt? Not that I know of. It's really figurative. What's the idea? Moses had done what in terms of Egypt, as far as the people of Israel? Delivered them. What's going to happen if they don't obey God once they go into the land? They're going to go back into captivity. They're going to go back into bondage. Okay, so a lot of detail there, a lot of interesting things, but let's move on here. And notice that he describes some of this same thing again in chapter 29. He reminds them of what the Lord had done for them, verses 2 down through verse 9. And he exhorts them to obey the Lord. Let me just push ahead here. Okay? So he wants them to obey, to do what God says. And before we get to chapter 30, let's just go down to the last verse of chapter 29. Having said all of these things, he says, you've probably heard this verse, the secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things that are revealed belong to us and to our children forever, that we may do all the words of this law. Now, what's the principle there? Okay. Has God told us everything we wish to know? Do you have any questions that you wish God had addressed in Scripture? Okay. So he's higher than we are. He knows more than we do. He hasn't revealed himself fully by any means. But he has revealed what he does for what reason? According to verse 29. That you may do all the words of the law. What he tells us so that we will be encouraged to do what he wants us to do. All right, so present setting, results of disobedience. Let's go on to chapter 30. So chapters 28 to 30 just kind of flow all together. So what's going to happen then in the future? He kind of looks back in chapter 29. Now he kind of looks forward beyond this disobedience about which he warns in chapter 28. So let's see what that's about. And when all these things come upon you, so they are going to come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I have set before you, and you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God has driven you. So that goes back to the end of chapter 28. They're going to come and take you and scatter you. But notice verse 2, and you return to the Lord your God, you and your children, and obey his voice in all that I command you today with all your heart and with all your soul. So what are the conditions of a return? They've been taken out of the land according to chapter 28. What do they have to do in order to return to the land? Obey God with heart, soul, and mind. Does that sound like anything we've read? Chapter 6, the Lord your God is one God, and you're to love him with heart, soul, and mind. So they need to return to that. Verse 3, then the Lord will restore your fortunes and have mercy on you, and he will gather you again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. So there is a promise of a return, but it is based upon their doing what the law says. Well, let's read on. Verse 5, and the Lord your God will bring you into the land that your fathers possessed, that you may possess it, and he will make you more prosperous and numerous than your fathers. Verse 6, and the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your offspring, so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live. And the Lord your God will put all these curses on your foes and enemies who persecuted you, and you shall again obey the voice of the Lord and keep all his commandments that I command you today. The Lord your God will make you abundantly prosperous in all the work of your hand. And then he repeats this fruit of the womb, cattle, ground. He'll take delight in prospering you. Verse 10, when you obey the voice of the Lord your God to keep his commandments and his statutes that are written in this book of the law. So question, did the children of Israel return from captivity? Yes. Now, we don't know that from Deuteronomy 30. We know that from subsequent history. They go through this whole cycle of disobeying God to the point where finally, because of idolatry, he takes them from the land. He scatters them, but they return. What do we learn from other passages besides Deuteronomy about that return? Who returns? It's a remnant that returns. It's not the entire nation. Now, in order for them to return, they've got to obey God and do his will. And if you look at the prayers of Daniel in Daniel 9, I think it's Ezra in Ezra 9, and what's the other one I'm missing? There's another chapter 9, where a prayer is prayed to God while they're in captivity or when they return back, which says, we want to return to you, heart, soul, and mind. So that is the basis upon which God's going to allow them to return. And there is a remnant that does return. Now, some would make of this, all right, well, we're still awaiting Israel's total return to the land, and one day Israel's going to flourish like they've never flourished before. And often that fuels a lot of expectations about events that are taking place over in Israel right now. So is chapter 30 telling us that one day Israel is going to suddenly return to its prominence or even greater? And the answer is no. In part, I'll give you a twofold reason for that. One reason is because this return in which they're going to flourish is going to be based on their keeping what law? Which law are we talking about here? The law of Moses. Okay. Subsequently, what happened to the law of Moses, say when Jesus came? Yeah. Ultimately, that law was set aside, and it was replaced by a new covenant. In fact, that new covenant is the basis upon which their hearts are really going to be truly circumcised, according to verse 6. So those changes are going to be affected not simply by a return of this remnant to the land, but by God instituting, as his plan always was, a new covenant. And that covenant's not going to be based upon what family you're born into. It's going to be based upon your disposition being one of wanting to do what God says. But let's look at a second reason there that I think is included in this passage. Look at verse 11. For this commandment that I command you today is not too hard for you, neither is it far off. It is not in heaven that you should say, who will ascend to heaven for us and bring it to us that we may hear it and do it. Neither is it beyond the sea that you should say, who will go over the sea for us and bring it to us that we may hear it and do it. So here God is saying, I want you to keep my law, and someone might say, well, how are we going to find out what your law is? Do we have to go up into heaven? Do we have to cross the sea in order to gather that word? And the answer is no. What's the last verse say there, verse 14? Why don't you have to go up into heaven or cross the sea in order to obey God? It's right there. The word is very near to you. It is in your mouth and in your heart so that you can do it. Now, keep that thought in mind. You've just studied Romans. Turn over to Romans chapter 10. And let's read a passage that sounds a lot like this one, but let's read it through the eyes of the gospel that God always intended to bring about. All right, so chapters 9 to 11 in Romans are Paul's explanation of what's going to happen to Israel. Okay? You know, is all Israel going to be saved? Well, no. And what part of Israel is going to be saved? The part that does what? Obeys the gospel. Okay, well, look at verse 5. For Moses writes about the righteousness that is based on the law, that the person who does the commandments shall live by them. That's exactly what we've been reading. Verse 6, but the righteousness based on faith says, do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven? Well, that's what we just read. And he adds, that is to bring Christ down. So he applies it to Christ. Or who will descend into the abyss? So instead of across the sea, into the abyss, that is to bring Christ up from the dead. But what does it say? The word is near you in your mouth and in your heart. But what's the word that he's speaking about here? It's no longer the old law. It's what word? The word of faith in whom? Christ. The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. That is the word of faith that we proclaim, because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. For the scripture says, everyone who believes in him will not be put to shame. Who does everyone include? Jew and Gentile, Jew and Greek. Look at verse 12. For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord is Lord of all, bestowing his riches on all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. My point is this. He takes the statement of Moses back in chapter 30 that's applied to the law, and now we look at it through the lens of Jesus Christ, and he says, this is the means by which God is going to save not just the Jew, but also the Gentile. And so the fulfillment of that passage back in Deuteronomy 30 is not some mass return of the Jews to Israel. It is the gospel being spread to both Jew and Gentile. And probably something that the Jew would never have fathomed back there in chapter 30. But the fulfillment of it is found here, among other places, in Romans chapter 10. Okay, we're almost out of time. So this circumcision of the heart ultimately will be as they repent and turn to Jesus as their Savior. Those commands are accessible. All right, the last chapter's there. Never got to my chart there. The last chapter is 31. Joshua is given the commission to take over from Moses. And you can imagine the concern that people might have when Moses, their leader for 40 years, is suddenly being replaced. Is there ever any angst when a cherished leader is replaced by someone else? Yeah, usually is. Chapter 32 is the Song of Moses. We don't have time to look at it. It's an interesting song because it speaks of God's grandeur and his majesty, but it also repeats this theme of Israel's disobedience. But it's a song that they learned to sing. Chapter 33, Moses blesses the people before he dies. Chapter 34. And that's closing the book on Deuteronomy, but really the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So here is a history intended for the children of Israel as they prepare to enter into the land. Where did they come from? Who is their God? And I think I said here, some questions that are left unanswered as we head on into Joshua and Judges. We know this and we know this, so I'm going to get to the questions. When is this descendant of the woman going to defeat evil? Back in Genesis 3. And how is God going to rescue the world through Abraham's family? Those are questions still to be answered. How can a holy God be reconciled to his rebellious people? Now, they've kind of gotten part of the answer with God providing this way by which they can have access, but it's still limited. How will God transform the hearts of his people? And we talked a little bit about that from chapter 30.